music to the noise, yeah, the mess we make. Machine Pun Kelly get caught in the fray. Facts and logic with a twist of jest. Strip it down to truth, yeah, forget the rest. Humor blows the lies right out of the park. Look beyond the shadows that set the dark. Sparks of laughter fire up the night, bringing clarity when they blur the fight. Cut through the chaos, yeah, the tangled lies. Fun Kelly with a set of clear eyes. Truths and jokes gonna rock this show. Step into light where the real facts glow.
So are you ready to step into the light where the real facts glow, Seth?
I am, as always.
You like my jamming song there?
I do. I'm gonna play that for Jill later.
It's actually not bad for AI.
No,
so joining me today is longtime social media friend and history professor Seth Weitz. Thanks for joining the show, Seth.
Thanks for having me on, Kelly.
I've been doing a series of slideshows this week, and not slideshows, but whiteboard videos on the history of gay rights and the criminalization of homosexuality. And as I was doing that, I became aware of something I had not previously been aware of, and a lot of people aren't aware of, even like on my timeline, which is a fairly liberal timeline, called the Lavender Scare. And it was actually, it was kind of like, it reminded me of finding out about the Tulsa Massacre, where you think, this is so outrageous. How is it not taught in history classes? And so this is something that I guess we'll start here and then work our way backwards, maybe.
Sure.
You, in one of your books, actually talked about the Lavender Scare and its particular relationship with Florida.
Yeah. Florida in the 1950s was similar to other southern states, but also different from other southern states in that South Florida was, and I hesitate to use the word liberal, it was liberal for the day, but a lot more liberal and progressive than the rest of the state, and obviously the rest of the Deep South. And because of and I don't want to get too much into the details, but because of Constitution, state of Florida Constitution from the 1880s, power in the state legislature, which was the power in the state Senate and the legislature was more powerful from the governor until the 1970s in Florida. And it was the second most malapportioned legislature in the country. There were several counties in North Florida that nobody's ever heard of today, even people that live in Florida. And I hope nobody is listening that's actually from one of those counties and will take offense to that. But there are several counties like Dixie County, Liberty County, Union County. Oddly enough, Union County and Dixie County are not allowed to be next to each other, but they're up in around the Gainesville area and up into the Panhandle. That
they're not allowed to be next to each other?
Union County, Dixie County.
Oh, I see.
It was a Civil War joke. It was a Civil War joke. I'm sorry. It's
I got
all right. See, it's yeah. They aren't next to each other. But anyway, Liberty County.
It's a bunch of professionals.
Liberty County is in the middle between Dixie and Union County.
Oh, well, there you go.
But even today, they have less than 10,000 people in them. Tiny counties. And up until the 1960s, but in the 1950s, at the time I'm going to briefly talk about, several of these counties had more representation in the state legislature than Dade County, where Miami is, or Hillsborough, where Tampa is, or Orange County, where Orlando is. You had counties with 10,000 people that had more representation in the legislature than counties with 1 million people in it. And so nobody knows exactly where this name came from, but there was a group of Southern Democrats, conservative Democrats, who called themselves the Pork Chop Gang in Florida. And there are two theories as to where it came from. One is because they said we eat pork and the people in South Florida eat lamb, and they're lamb choppers. And another was it had to do with the pork in the legislature. But regardless of it, they wanted to hold on to power in Florida at any cost. And so in the 1950s, led by a state senator named Charlie Johns, they created what was called the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, which is shortened to FLIC, which sounds ridiculous, and it was ridiculous. More commonly known as the Johns Committee after Charlie Johns. But they framed themselves as a bulwark against communism, as everything else was in the 1950s. Right. They first investigated the NAACP to stop integration in Florida, but they framed it as stopping communism. Communists were trying to integrate the schools in Florida. They failed miserably trying to halt integration. I don't say miserably because it still took 20 years, but they failed to halt integration. And again, we don't know exactly why and how they made the shift, but in the late 1950s, they made the shift to investigating what they called immorality, sexual deviance, but it was homosexuality on the campuses of Florida's, at the time, 3 state universities. Yeah, the University of Florida, Florida State, and the University of South Florida was brand new. But most of the focus was on the University of Florida. And
can you explain real quick, because I didn't actually cover it, what the lavender scare was? Because I think you're getting into how this all ties into it.
Yeah. So the lavender scare was the best definition I've seen of it, and this is in quotes, was a moral panic about homosexuality. But it wasn't just, anti-gay. It was a quote unquote scare like the Red Scare about communism, but it was a scare about homosexual people in government, largely the State Department, but in all walks of government, that coincided with the Red Scare in the 1950s, McCarthyism and all of that. The idea was, or the justification for it, was that because homosexuality was, first of all, illegal in many states. For example, Florida, since that's where I do most of my research and stuff, so I know the specific laws. Illinois actually had a really strict law too, but Florida, homosexuality was a crime against nature. And it could be, it wasn't, not that it's made it any better, it wasn't, but it could be, or you could face up to 20 years in prison. And so the idea behind the so-called lavender scare was that homosexuals could possibly be approached for blackmail. And the fear was by the Soviet agents, spies, KGB, whatever. They could approach a person they knew to be gay working in the United States government and basically blackmail them, say, spy for us or we're telling, and you're going to lose your job and never be hired again, and all of this stuff. And it led to hundreds of firings in the United States government in the 1950s. The same thing that happened with McCarthy and communism, it was happening in this. And there's one thing, and I won't bore your listeners with details about this, but they got the idea, McCarthy and all the people got the idea actually from something that happened 50 years before, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of all places, there was an Austrian army intelligence officer who was homosexual. He was approached by the Russian Empire, by Russian spies, and kind of flipped to spy for Russia, saying that, we will tell the Austrians that you're gay, you lose your job. He spied for Russia right before World War One. There's debate in the historical community about whether some of the stuff that he gave the Russians actually helped Russia during World War One, but he ended up committing suicide, which several people did during the red and lavender scares in the United States, committing suicide when they were outed. And so that's where people usually make the ties. But the first time we actually hear the word lavender was Senator Dirksen, who, the Senate building is named after today. Senator Dirksen, Republican senator from Illinois, said that we need to remove these lavender lads from the State Department. And so that was the first time he used the phrase lavender scare. We don't have exact numbers, but we know from late 40s, early 50s, close to 2,000 people had their applications rejected to government service because they were either gay or thought to be gay, or somebody said they were gay.
And they were having like full-blown congressional hearings on whether people were gay or not, right? Like,
yeah, it wasn't as prevalent as the McCarthy hearings and things like that, the communist hearings and HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. But yes, there were things like some of it. One difference between the lavender scare and the red scare is a lot of the stuff with the lavender scare was done privately. And what I mean by privately was they would come to somebody they suspected of being gay and they'd say, resign or we're going to fire you, but we're not going to do it publicly. Communism, they did it publicly. The Red Scare, a lot of it, they did it publicly.
And with Dwight Eisenhower actually signed an executive order that said
he did.
You could not work for the federal government if you were gay.
Yep. It was executive, because I'm a history nerd, as my wife says. Executive Order 10450 banned homosexuals from working in the federal government, and over 5,000 employees were fired because of it. This executive order was not technically repealed until 2017. President Obama's last executive order, Executive Order 13087 in 2017, repealed it. Federal judge ruled it unconstitutional in 1973. The federal government said they would stop considering people on or would consider people on a case-to-case basis, people who they weren't known to be homosexuals in 1975, but it wasn't until 2017 that it was officially repealed. Kind of the last thing, the irony in all of this was J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were heavily involved in this, and still debates today over Hoover's sexuality. Joseph McCarthy's right-hand man, Roy Cohn, was the worst kept secret in Washington that he was gay. And there were even rumors, unfounded rumors, but rumors that McCarthy and Roy Cohn were in a homosexual relationship at the time. But they were the ones going after the homosexual community at the time.
There were some people that, I'm kind of going off of what I've heard, not what I've read, but that there were people that were, in terms of the civil rights movement, on fighting for civil rights, but at the same time were fighting against the civil rights of the of gays and lesbians and whatnot. Is that right?
Yes, but it's nuanced. It's not cut and dry. Part of the problem was J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and others they would try to blackmail or try to stop the civil rights movement. I'll give you the perfect example was what they did to Martin Luther King Jr. They tried, Hoover and the FBI tried for 10 years to paint him as a communist. There were several gay men, Bayard Rustin is the best example. Several gay men that were in the civil rights movement, close to Dr. King, and the FBI and others tried to turn members of the civil rights movement against the gay members of the civil rights movement, which in turn hurt the gay rights movement, if you follow that weird flow chart I just made. But you had organizations, various civil rights organizations that come out and say, basically, we're against communism, we're against homosexuality. And they would do it, whether or not they actually were, they would do it to try to, help their cause in a way to say, if the FBI is calling us communist, if the FBI is saying we have gay people in our members, we'll put out a memo saying that we oppose all of that.
So, hang on one second. Sorry, I had to put some eye drops in there for a second. My allergies are killing me right now. So that's why I'm crying. It's not that what you're saying wasn't touching, but now then let's get back to Florida and how specifically the lavender scare affected Florida.
Yeah.
You got some background on that.
One thing I want to say, because I think this needs to be said before we get into this, is there were anti-gay laws dating back to before the Revolutionary War in the United States. Some of them were called sodomy laws, and obviously technically did not just affect gay people, even though 99 out of 100 times that's who they were actually aimed at. For example, when Thomas Jefferson was the governor of Virginia, he tried to amend the state's sodomy laws and anti-gay laws to say that you didn't get the death penalty. He tried to amend it and lessen it to castration.
Wow.
But prior to 1962, every single state, all 50 states, had some sort of anti-sodomy law, which was obviously mostly aimed at the homosexual community. Some states had lengthy prison sentences, even hard labor. It wasn't until 2003, Lawrence v. Texas, United States Supreme Court case, that officially ended all of this. I say officially because as of today, there are still 12 states that criminalize sodomy. Florida, Georgia, Kansas, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Oklahoma, and Texas. Still,
and Maryland just repealed theirs in 2020.
Maryland just repealed it in it was either, I think it was 2023 or 2024. Maryland just repealed theirs. Yeah, several states did it in 2006, 2013, 2000. But 2003 was the Supreme Court case, and still today there are 12 states. So I just thought that was important before we got to. So what they did in Florida specifically is they targeted the 3 state universities: University of Florida, Florida State University, University of South Florida. They did not have much success at Florida State and the University of South Florida, mostly because the presidents of those schools were resistant to it. The presidents of those schools went out of their way to protect the faculty and the students. The president of the University of Florida, Wayne Wrights, he was cooperative with this Florida Legislative Investigation Committee. He cooperated fully. He welcomed them on campus. He worked, and the committee worked hand in hand. It was something like out of, Soviet Russia with the KGB or Nazi Germany with the Gestapo. They recruited students to be informants and to pretend to be gay and pick up other students. And then the police would, kind of like swoop in and arrest them. It was like McCarthyism in that they wanted more names. So if they found one student or one professor that was gay, they might say, we won't tell anybody if you can tell us 7 other people who were. And oftentimes, people were terrified. They set up they called it this. They set up an interrogation suite in a motel in downtown Gainesville, where they'd bring these suspected homosexuals or people who are actually gay, and they'd interrogate them. They had like a light shining in their eyes. It's, anything you think out of like these movies and stuff, it happened. And people obviously cracked under pressure and named names and did all this other stuff. They set up cameras in the men's room of the Alachua County Courthouse. All of these things that are,
and these things were like much more
illegal.
Targeted at gays than lesbians, right?
Yes,
like,
and that was throughout.
It went after some lesbians, but it was mostly about the gays.
Yes, and I think a lot of that just had to do with the idea that men could be more dangerous. That it was misogynistic, even in kind of sparing the lesbian community, and they did go after some, and there were, but even in kind of going, heavier after the gay male population and sparing the lesbian, not sparing, but it was misogynistic because they thought men were a bigger threat. Men were the problem. Women couldn't be the problem. And it also, like in the Lavender Scare nationwide, it was just a fact. There were more men working in the federal government at the time, more men in the military. The military had their own kind of lavender. It wasn't called the Lavender Scare, but during World War II, there were thousands of soldiers who were, kicked out, dishonorably discharged, not allowed to get into the military. And
that's
stuff
when I
like
was
that.
in the military in the 90s, and I was in the military from 86 to 90. And my second assignment was at San Vito Air Station in Italy. And there was a small group of gays that were there. And the OSI, the AFOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, kind of like the Navy equivalent or the Air Force equivalent of NCIS, did a sting operation on the gays that were at that base. And one of them was, or actually I was friends with all of them, but one of them in particular, told me that he was interested in me. And I told him, I'm sorry, I'm not gay, but, best of luck to you. And so then another couple of weeks went by and another guy hit on me, and I told him, I'm not gay, but I know somebody who is. If you're interested, I can set you up. And then the next morning I get called into the OSI headquarters, and I get sat down, and the guy that had hit on me the night before reveals himself to be an undercover OSI agent that was running a sting operation on the gays. And so they asked me to write down what I had said the night before, and I refused to. And because I wasn't gonna, testify against a friend of mine. Anyway, long story short, they ended up running up a bunch of paperwork on me to punish me for not testifying against the gays and all of that. And this was in the 90s. I mean, this was not like back in the 50s or something like that. This is still, at least, relatively recent history. And I think a lot of times people, they don't realize how recent the advancements in gay rights are.
Yes, definitely.
Even just a couple of decades ago, you had literal military sting operations being run against gay people in the military. So, to give people some real life experience of this is really bad. If you were gay, you could get your entire life destroyed with a dishonorable discharge.
Right, and because the whole idea of, how many millions of people, pretended to be straight.
Mhm.
And it was, one of the interesting things, and it makes sense when you think about it, is, civil rights movement, civil rights organizations for, say, African Americans. A lot of these civil rights organizations date back to the early 20th century. Well, the
Mhm.
first gay rights, like official gay rights organization or civil rights organization for gay people, is not founded until the 1960s. It's because, again, like, you can't hide being black, so
Yeah.
you can hide being gay, and so it just kind of took. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it took longer to kind of start the gay rights movement, when I think there was a lot of it was sort of and I don't know if this is the right word, but an awakening during the civil rights movement of the 1950s, during the Black
Mhm.
civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. It awakened a lot of homosexuals. It awakened a lot of, Latinos. That's when you get the brown power movement also. It just kind of awakened all of these different minority groups to openly push for civil rights when they hadn't before.
And a lot of these,
So
like there was something called the Stone. What is it? Stone something. There was a big kind of uprising
the
riots that
Stonewall
the
uprising. Yeah.
Stonewall right, and then that was actually instigated by a couple of black trans women.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if some of that crossover comes from the fact that there were people involved in the civil rights movement who were also
Yeah.
gay or lesbian or trans that brought that mentality into the gay community.
Yeah, and I think with that, the Stonewall, what was been called the Stonewall riots, were in the field. We're moving away from the word riot to describe these things because it has a kind of negative connotation.
Yeah.
Uprising is the word that's being used more, but that was the Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York City that everybody knew was a gay bar. Like, it was actually run by the mafia, which was a fascinating other side story. And the mafia paid off the police basically to not really do much about it. But periodically, the police would raid the bar, and obviously, it was terrifying. But what led to these riots, uprisings, was one time the police raided the bar, and a crowd outside of hundreds of people tried to stop the police basically from arresting the gay people inside, and it turned into 5 days of what were called riots at the time, basically.
And there was like a law that you had to dress according to the
Your
gender that
sex.
was on your driver's
Yes,
license, right? And
exactly. And
that
yeah,
was
and I know,
ostensibly the
again,
purpose they were arresting
yeah,
them.
a lot of it was what they called at the time cross-dressing. That was the name for it in the 60s and 70s. I know, and again, I hate to use Florida, but because that's what all my research is on. Florida had laws on the books against this into the 1970s and possibly even the 1980s, against cross-dressing, as they called it at the time. But yeah, that was the major thing in all of this. And after this, from out of the Stonewall riots, you really you had some semblance of a gay rights movement before. I want to mention his name because he's often thought of the first gay rights activist, Frank Kameny. He was an astronomer who actually worked for the U.S. Army, and he was fired by the Army for being gay in the 1950s. He had a PhD from Harvard, brilliant man, and the Army just said, "No, you're gay. We can't have you." And he helped to found one of the first gay rights organizations in the late 1950s. You had a couple in the 1960s. I mean, this man picketed outside the White House for gay rights in 1965 by himself. I mean, the courage that had to take in the atmosphere of everything that's going on to picket in front of the White House by himself in 1965. But
Wow.
after Stonewall, you start to see pride parades. I mean, that was one of the big things that came from Stonewall. Was on the first anniversary of what happened, the Stonewall riots. You had pride parades in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles. Next year, you had pride parades. 1971, you had pride parades in Boston, Dallas, Milwaukee. Next year, Atlanta, Buffalo, Detroit, DC, Miami, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, San Francisco. But then it takes until 2009 till
Why did they
Obama,
call them pride parades?
What's that?
Why did they call them pride parades?
Just because they started using the word gay pride for the first time. In 1970, you had the Gay Liberation Front. It was actually the first time that any sort of organization or movement used the word gay in their title. But the 70s is when you really start to see the gay community openly have, well, for lack of a better term, and honestly, not to steal, part of your name, but no pun intended, you start to see the gay community have or openly show pride in who they are and who they were.
And this was like in contrast to centuries of feeling like they had to be ashamed of who they were, hide who they were. Is that, I mean, so is it, did they deliberately claim the word pride as a contrast to that? Was it like a backlash to the way they had been shamed for being who they are?
I think you could say that, yeah. And you hear all the time. I'm not going to label people on the other side, but we'll just call them bigots. You hear people who are homophobic, who will say they're shoving it in our faces. Why do they have to do this out in the open? And I think you hit the nail on the head. Part of the reason is because for thousands of years they couldn't. It's like, and now as a society, for obviously not everybody, there are plenty of people who this is not okay with, but we're much more open and welcoming as a society that they finally feel like they can do this out in the open. And if you've been suppressed for so long, human nature says you want to do the opposite. You want to show the pride, for using that word again.
So, as long as we're getting into the beginning of this, and we have a listener, Joe, that brings up Harvey Milk. Can you talk a little bit about Harvey Milk and how he played into the civil rights movement?
Yeah, I mean, Harvey Milk was the first openly gay man elected to the San Francisco City Council. And he was also involved in San Francisco in the 70s, became one of the kind of centers of the gay communities across the country. And he met a tragic end to it, where he was killed, basically because of it. And I think, Harvey Milk and a lot of these other people, these stories weren't known. Harvey Milk, his story might not have been known until they made the movie about him, 15, 20 years ago or whatever it was. Unless you were looking for these stories, they were not known. They're not taught. I never, I took every history class imaginable from, high school through graduate school. And I don't think anything that had to do with the gay community at all, except for one class. And it's when I took a class on McCarthyism, and there was a section on it that dealt with the Lavender Scare. But it's still today, it's glossed over in history. If you take a civil rights class in college, I don't want to speak for every professor out there, but most of the times it won't talk, or it'll barely talk about the gay rights movement and things like that. I think we're finally just starting to even talk about it in an academic setting.
Yeah. Well, it's still such modern history. I mean, like Clinton imposed "Don't Ask, Don't Tell," right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually a big victory for gay rights.
Yeah,
Then
and
when Obama ended it, that was like another big victory for
exactly.
gay rights. This is not ancient history we're talking about.
Right, and it's like
Obergefell was like 2013.
Yeah, Clinton thought, and the feeling was at the time that was good. Don't ask, don't tell was good because you shouldn't have people getting fired or discharged from the military for
there
sexual
weren't any more
orientation.
sting operations like the one I got caught up in.
But it also just reinforced the notion that you have to stay closeted. You have to hide. Like, we won't ask you, but you can't tell. We won't go after anybody, but you better not make it known that you're gay. So that's why what you said was perfect. Like, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a win in the 90s, but then repealing 20 years later was also a win, an even bigger win. And of course, now we have everything with the first Trump administration going after trans service members, and then Biden repealing that, and Trump probably going back to it. And so, it's definitely this isn't. And I tell my students this with not just these sorts of things, but with anything. I try to, and I think people don't realize this all the time. This is not ancient history. Some of it is, if you're literally teaching about ancient history, but a lot of this stuff is not ancient history. These people that were affected by this are still alive, many of them. There was a documentary, the University of Central Florida did a documentary about what happened at the University of Florida. And it was about 20 years ago, 15 years ago that they did it. But in the documentary, you had one of the undercover police officers from Gainesville meet up with one of the students, gay students, that they basically got kicked out of the school. Mm-hmm. And they made amends, and the police officer apologized for what he had done, but he still apologized in a way that was like, it was the times. Not saying what I did was wrong, but he was like, saying it was the times were different in the 50s. I mean, he apologized, but in a,
it wasn't my fault kind of way.
Yes, exactly. It was sort of like I was following orders, but it was also the times. Times were different back then, But, just I show this in class just to reinforce the point that my students think the 50s is ancient history, but these people, one of them, he actually died recently, but when they made this documentary 15 years ago, they were still alive. And they weren't, 90 years old either. They were, in their 50s or 60s at the time. So it's not ancient history. Yeah.
And then like Obergefell, you want to talk a little bit about Obergefell and what that means to the movement?
Yeah. I mean, this is something that the United States was slow on, as with a lot of things, compared to some of the world, we'll say. And I say some of the world because, I actually looked this up last night because I didn't have the statistics off the top of my head. But as of 2025, there are only 38 countries in the world where same-sex couples can legally be married.
Wow.
So out of, the United Nations recognizes close to 200 countries or something like that. So it's a very small, if you want to say it like that. I mean, there's still some countries where gay couples do get married, but it's not recognized by the state. Basically, countries that we would think of as, and I hate to use this term, but developed countries like Japan, South Korea, Czech Republic, Italy, they don't officially have, a law on the books like we do. But, the first same-sex marriage in the United States actually took place in 1971. And that's because the state of Minnesota decided to recognize it. So from the 70s up until 10 years ago, it was kind of on a state-by-state basis. But the problem with that is, if you move to a different state that doesn't recognize it, or if you get sick and you're in a hospital in a state that doesn't recognize it, your husband, as recognized by the state that you lived in, doesn't have the same rights as visitation rights. And, I always hear people who oppose same-sex marriage say, what's the big deal? They can still live together. Why do they need to get married? They don't think about a lot of the things that straight marriages have, like, inheritance, stuff like that. Things like tax breaks, tax benefits, visitation rights in hospitals, and right of power of attorney, those things that people, obviously the most important thing is people being able to marry the person they love and not have, but when people oppose it, the first place I always go if I'm arguing with them is, how would you feel if you were married and your wife or husband was sick and you couldn't visit them in the hospital? You couldn't make the decision on whether to take them off life support or keep them on life support. You couldn't inherit, inherit their property when they pass, stuff like that. And while it's obviously not going to change a lot of people's minds, some people, I think, look at it and they're like, oh, okay, that is something I never thought of, at least.
Yeah, I think, to me, the government should, the whole idea of marriage is the government is just recognizing the legal legitimacy of a relationship. It's just saying this relationship legally exists for legal purposes, like visitation in the hospitals or whatever. It is not about the moral legitimacy of a relationship. So even if you want to say that it's moral or whatever, the state recognizing the actuality of that relationship is not an endorsement of it. It's just an acknowledgement of it. And that's all. We do not need the government getting into the morality business and deciding what is or is not moral, and
but it is because, and it has throughout the history of the world, really. I mean, I just read an article yesterday where, the North Dakota state legislature is about to ask the United States Supreme Court to undo. I see that up there. Yeah, that's true. But the North Dakota state legislature is about to ask the United States Supreme Court to undo basically the previous ruling and undo same-sex marriage. What comes of it, who knows? With this United States Supreme Court, anything can happen. But just the fact that they're doing it at the time, today, that they're doing it now, should tell you we've come far, but we haven't come far.
I have a friend, I won't mention any names. They lived in North Dakota. They're in a gay marriage, and they actually, basically, they were in a small town in North Dakota, and after the Trump win, felt like they basically had to move for their own safety, so they moved to a different state to where they felt safer, and that's just sad and terrifying at the same time.
Nobody should have to do that for. Nobody should have to do that for any reason. Yeah. Obviously, I was going to say today, but then nobody should have had to have done that for any reason ever. But, but especially today, nobody should have to do that for any reason. But yeah, I mean, I live in Tennessee. People ask me all the time, how do you live in Tennessee? You know, I'm a straight white man, but they're still like, how do you live in Tennessee? And, you know,
I live in Texas.
yeah, I know. It's
But I do say pound for pound, Tennessee is right up there in the stupidity contest with Texas and Florida.
No, I think see, here's where I will die on this hill that we're dumber. I think a lot of the lawmakers in Texas are actually smart and evil. I think a lot of the lawmakers in Tennessee are probably monitoring this call now, and I'm gonna, you know, but anyway, a lot of the lawmakers in Tennessee, I think, are evil and dumb. Like, we literally had a Republican on the floor of the state legislature in Tennessee quoting The Onion. He didn't realize it was, parody, satirical. That's where we are in Tennessee. So
at least they weren't quoting Chinese propaganda. Was it Matt Gaetz that got caught quoting Chinese propaganda?
Well, it all runs together. I don't know. I just saw yesterday or a couple days ago that our esteemed Senator Marsha Blackburn is probably going to run for governor of Tennessee. So it's,
oh my goodness,
going from bad to worse.
I call her Senator Wheathead.
She
looks like she just has a head full of wheat.
Yeah, but I don't want to, say our state is worse than any other state, but I just think our politicians are evil and dumb. Where other states, like, Ted Cruz, we could talk about him all the time, but he is actually a smart person, which makes him more dangerous, I think. But anyway.
So Joe has a good question. How do we make our LGBTQ friends and family feel safe? And like, just my rough answer is, I don't know if we can right now.
Yes,
I think we need to, like, we need to take back the government to some level at first, just to protect them legislatively, like to at least block Republican legislation. But in Dobbs, Clarence Thomas kind of wrote a little suggestion for the right wing that maybe because Dobbs, Roe versus Wade was based on the right to privacy, the constitutional right to privacy. In Dobbs, they said, well, there is no constitutional right to privacy. And so then Thomas, in saying that, who, by the way, is in an interracial marriage, which is protected by the constitutional right to privacy, said that maybe some other things like Obergefell might be, worth taking a look at now, that, privacy is no longer considered a constitutional right, which it is a constitutional right, by the way, but we won't get into that.
I think, the most important thing, obviously, legally, constitutionally, all that is the top of the food chain, but on a day-to-day basis, and it's getting harder and harder to even do this, but on a day-to-day basis, do things like, I have outside my office, I teach at a state college in Georgia. I live in Tennessee, but Chattanooga's right on the border with Georgia. A lot of people don't realize that. But I teach in Marjorie Taylor Greene's district. I'll just throw that out there too. I have a sign outside of my office that basically says, and it has a gay pride flag on it, and it says, everyone is welcome in here, like in my office. Like, I want my office to be a safe space, and I have several other colleagues who have similar things. Why I said it's becoming harder and harder to do this is you have groups like Moms for Liberty, this happened recently in Chattanooga. They doxed a school teacher in Chattanooga who had a gay pride flag, a Guatemalan flag in her room, and I think a Black Lives Matter flag in her room. And they doxed the teacher, put her home address on the internet. And so, you have these groups that don't just oppose it, but that are actively trying to not just attack the gay community, but attack anybody who tries to, make the gay community or any community feel welcome. But what I try to tell people is, whether it's, a Black person after George Floyd, or, just letting them know that you stand with them, a gay person by doing these sorts of things, letting you know that they're welcome in your church, your home, your classroom, your office, whatever. Jewish community after October 7th saying, we understand, Muslim community after 9/11 was a big one. Telling them we don't all, think you're terrorists, and so, on a person-to-person basis, letting people know that you support them. While obviously that's not going to change a state law or stop the North Dakota legislature from trying to overturn, the Constitution, constitutional, stop something in the Constitution or a law or Supreme Court decision or whatever. I think that can give, comfort and just peace of mind to people. And I think we all need, if you're an ally, be an ally. And don't just say you're an ally. Be an ally. Be there for the people you claim to be an ally of. And I think that's the best thing we can do on a day-to-day basis.
That's great advice. I think just knowing that you have a support structure outside of the gay community.
Yeah, I mean, I just, not to take it on a tangent, but I teach, again, in a very, 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 very red part of Georgia, but we have a very, very, very large Hispanic population in the area. And after Trump was elected for the first time, I had students crying in my office. They didn't know what was going to happen to family members who were undocumented. And obviously we're going through this again now. So, just being there for people and letting them know that you will do your best to protect them, but also be there for them emotionally is, what we can do every day.
Yeah, I think that in all I wonder sometimes how some MAGAs actually feel about all this. Like, I know it's easy to just kind of say, well, they voted for Trump, they're assholes, they're bigots, they're racists, whatever. But I mean, like does some of them look at what's going on and like have Hispanic friends who like tell them my dad is going to get deported, and like have an ounce of compassion for that? Like, are there some that will look at this and become human, like re-engage the human side of them? Like, they're not all terrible monsters.
Yeah, and I feel like when I say this, I lose my liberal card, but yes, and I know people that, but the problem is getting them not to vote for Trump or Republicans again. I know people, like I know someone who is involved in the local Republican county stuff down where I teach and stuff, and they've been banned from Marjorie Taylor Greene events because they hate Marjorie Taylor. But when push comes to shove, they might not vote for Marjorie Taylor Greene, but they still vote for Trump and every other Republican on the ballot. I know people who will say, and there are people out there who say this is, whether they say this is worse than we thought or this is wrong. But the problem is, or the struggle is getting them to not vote Republican again. They can say we don't like what he's doing to X people all we want, but if they then vote for him or JD Vance next time, or whoever, God forbid, they put up next time, then it doesn't matter. It's great that personally and privately they feel bad or have sympathy or empathy, but if they keep voting for it, then
yeah, that's the. I have a friend who is he's gay. He's married to a Muslim foreign national and a Trump supporter, and I just cannot figure out how those cards line up. I had a friend that she ended up blocking me, but I was in the Air Force with. She was a black lesbian Trump supporter, and I would joke with her, "You are the entire black lesbian caucus." Like,
yeah.
I don't see how many of those there are in the that are in the MAGA movement, and I don't understand how. Like,
we know
they
somebody
vote directly against their own interest in so many ways.
We know. I don't want to get into. This is how paranoid I am with everything that's going on. I don't want to get into specifics because I don't want ICE showing up on their door. But we know somebody who came to the United States from a Latin American country when they were 7. They are now in their 20s. When they grew up in the South, when they speak Spanish, they have a Southern accent. When they speak English, they have a Southern accent. They remember nothing about the country that they came from. They married an American-born citizen. They have a kid together who's obviously a citizen. The person's mother-in-law voted for Trump. And I was just sitting there, you literally just voted to have your, and I don't, your child's spouse possibly deported and your grandchild possibly deported. And I don't, and they voted for Trump because of the economy, but like, I don't get it.
That's
and I
working
think that's part
out
of the
well.
problem. Yeah.
Oh man, I don't even. Anyway, and there, I wanted to give you a chance to vent about something else that's kind of related. You're a proud alum of Tulane University, and they just announced that they are getting rid of their DEI program because they've been blackmailed into it.
Yeah, they just announced yesterday that they are closing their Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion as of yesterday because the Trump administration, yes, Tulane is a private school, but I think a lot of people don't realize that private institutions still get a lot of federal funds. The Trump administration threatened to withhold $320 million of federal funding if they didn't close the office. Now, my one hope that the president of Tulane is, I think, a genuinely decent person. So my one hope is, and they've already said they're closing the office, but they're renaming it the Office of Academic Excellence. I don't know. I've not spoken with anybody at Tulane, but I'm hoping that they continue to do the same things that the Office of Diversity did. Just they're not calling it to get around Trump's bullying. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen. That's my one hope in all of this. But yes, they did close it yesterday, and it was very disheartening.
So Greg has a comment. When some people have known Democrats as anti-American for their entire adult lives, crossing the aisle feels like giving up on America in their heads. And I think that's right. I think that even like when they talk about Make America Great Again, or on Fox News, they'll talk about real Americans or the American voters or whatever, as though
code words
that disagree with them are not American. Like Democrats are not Americans. They've managed to make Republican and American like synonymous in their heads.
And again, this is not meant to defend MAGA in any way, but this is nothing new. I mean, Republicans have been doing this for decades. Politicians have been doing this, for centuries. But yeah, it's a good point people, and I hate to use the word brainwashed, but people have been brainwashed to thinking the other side is not just ideologically wrong, but immoral, evil, whatever. And so, when people say, well, we could just get them to vote Democratic, some people you're never going to get. I mean, there are some people that are so far gone because of not just since Trump came along, but not just since Fox News came along, going back to even Reagan and Nixon. Just the other side is not ideologically wrong. They are evil. They are the devil. They are anti-American. All you have to do is go read the comments on Facebook. The most common word that people call Democrats is satanic. I mean, so it's not, I disagree with you ideologically, you're the devil. And
yeah, and that's what happens when you start getting religion all mixed up in everything.
Yeah.
Is it's like you're not, there was one thing, I was reading one report. Somebody went back and they looked at the text of every single prayer before a Trump rally. And every single prayer, they would pray that God would bless Trump and bless what he wants to do. It was always, every single one was a prayer for God to do right by Trump, never for Trump to do right by God. Like that, and that really struck me. That's where they're at, is like Trump is the Overton window, Trump is the Bible, Trump, whatever Trump says goes. And that's not just true politically, that's even true according to their religious conviction. So if you're opposed to Trump, you're opposed to Trump.
Yeah, I've heard people say, or seen people say, basically, like, I didn't know Democrats could be Christian. And I was like, I don't even know how to respond to that. I don't even know how to respond to that. But I think sometimes,
I like to joke that Jesus rode a donkey, but he never rode an elephant.
Yeah, seriously. I sometimes think we, and when I say we, I mean people in the progressive, liberal, Democrat, whatever we want to call ourselves, this community, we fall into the trap of not fully understanding what we're up against. And I think the perfect example was the State of the Union. And I don't want to go down that hole, but, coordinating outfits and raising signs, that might have worked against George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Reagan or Gerald Ford. That's not working against this Republican Party. This is a weaponized Republican Party. This is totally different. It's not even the Republican Party anymore.
I think we lost you for a moment. So until you get back, unless, is it me or you? I hope it's not me. So one of us is, so Seth just let me know that his computer crashed. So that's why he is suspended. And you notice whenever you get like frozen on a whenever you get frozen on a screen, it's never with a flattering facial expression. So anyway, I think what he's saying is really important, that we need to not lose sight that it's not just a politics thing, but a religious thing. It's like a much deeper conviction for Republicans than just Trump. It's gotten to the point where it's their very conviction and belief in God that's on the line. So I think since we have lost Seth, and he texted me and to let me know that his computer crashed. I think we'll just go ahead and we'll end here. Thank you for joining. Thank you for commenting, Mimi and Greg and Joe and whoever else was watching. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your feedback. And also, if you haven't already looked at it, I have been doing a series of whiteboard videos, and there's a playlist on LGBTQ plus rights. So if you want to just go through and look at those, I'll be doing some more of those over the next few days as well, including one, Joe, on Harvey Milk is planned for today. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye.